I bought my first home at 31, and my parents told everyone in the family I had got help from them, when I had done it entirely alone, and when I corrected them publicly, they said I was being disrespectful. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from being misrepresented by people who love you. It is different from being misrepresented by strangers or enemies, different in a way that is hard to articulate precisely, but that anyone who has experienced it will recognize immediately. With strangers, you can dismiss it. With enemies, you can contextualize it. With people who love you, the misrepresentation lands in a place that has no clean defense, because the love is real, and the misrepresentation is also real, and you are left trying to hold both of those things at once in a space that was not designed to contain them simultaneously. I have been holding both of those things for about 2 years now. I am getting better at it, but I want to be honest that it is still work. My name is Nadia. I am 33 years old. I bought my first home when I was 31, in a mid-sized city where I had been living for 5 years, after 4 years of deliberate and disciplined saving that had required me to make choices I did not always enjoy making, and to maintain a level of financial focus that left very little room for the kind of spending that makes your 20s feel abundant. I did not go on the trips my friends went on. I did not upgrade my car when my car became embarrassing. I brought lunch to work for 4 years with a consistency that became something of a running joke among my colleagues. I knew what I was doing, and I knew why, and the knowing made the choices sustainable, even when they were tedious. I bought a 2-bedroom house in a neighborhood I had been watching for 3 years. It needed some work, which was fine, because the work was the reason it was in my price range, and I had factored the work into the budget I had spent months building. I closed on a Tuesday afternoon in September, and sat in the empty living room on the floor afterward for about 20 minutes just being in the space, alone, in something that was mine. It was one of the better 20 minutes of my adult life. I called my parents that evening. My mother cried. My father said he was proud of me. I told them about the house, the neighborhood, the plan for the repairs. It was a warm conversation, the kind you hope to have with your parents about a significant achievement, and I went to bed that night feeling uncomplicated happiness in a way that I had earned and that I wanted to sit in for as long as it lasted. It lasted about 3 weeks. My parents are not bad people. I want to establish that with the same firmness I have established it for myself over the past 2 years, because the story I am about to tell makes them look bad in ways that I do not think fully capture who they are. They are people who love their children loudly and publicly, and who have always expressed that love partly through the language of involvement, through the sense that their children's achievements are achievements the family has participated in together. This is a cultural thing to some extent, a generational thing to some extent, and a them thing to some extent, and all 3 of those layers have been relevant to my thinking about what happened. What happened is this. The first family gathering after I bought the house was my aunt's birthday dinner, about 3 weeks after I closed. 15 or so relatives at a long table in my aunt's dining room, the kind of gathering where news gets shared and discussed and absorbed into the collective family narrative. I had been looking forward to it. I had photographs on my phone of the house, and I was genuinely excited to show people and receive the kind of congratulations that a major milestone deserves. My aunt asked about the house early in the dinner. She said she had heard I had bought a place and she wanted to hear all about it. I started to answer, and my mother, with what I know was genuine warmth and zero awareness of what she was doing, said yes, we are so proud of her, we really helped her make it happen. The table made the sounds of impressed approval. My aunt said how wonderful that they had been able to help. My cousin asked what kind of help they had given. My mother, warming to the narrative, said, oh, you know, we helped her look, we helped her think through the finances, we were very involved. I sat at that table and felt something go very still inside me. I did not say anything in that moment. The conversation moved on, the way conversations at family dinners move on, and the version of events my mother had just casually introduced became part of the room's understanding of what had happened. By the end of the dinner, several relatives had congratulated my parents on being so supportive, and my father had received those congratulations with a modest smile that suggested he was accepting something he felt was accurate. I drove home alone that night and tried to figure out what I was feeling. It was not a simple feeling. There was anger in it, clearly, the sharp and specific anger of having something misrepresented. But there was also something more complicated underneath the anger, something that had to do with the 4 years. The 4 years of lunches brought from home and trips not taken, and a car that embarrassed me, and a savings account I checked every week like it was a patient I was monitoring. My parents had not contributed to those 4 years. They had not contributed financially, not a single dollar, which they had told me clearly when I first started the process, because they were managing their own retirement finances carefully, and it was not something they were in a position to do. I had understood that completely and had not expected anything else. But the 4 years had happened anyway. The discipline had been mine. The sacrifice had been mine. The Tuesday afternoon on the floor of the empty living room had been mine in a way that was specific and earned, and that I had not needed anyone to share in order for it to mean what it meant. And now it had been shared, retroactively, without my knowledge or consent, in a way that redistributed the meaning of it to include people who had not been part of it. I called my mother 2 days later. I kept my voice even and my approach direct and non-accusatory, because I genuinely believed at the time that what had happened was unconscious and that a simple conversation would resolve it. I told her what I had heard her say at the dinner, and I told her it wasn't accurate. I said she and Dad had not helped me financially or practically with the purchase, that I had done it on my own, and that I would like the record to be accurate when it came up in family conversations going forward. My mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said she hadn't meant it the way it sounded, that she had only meant they had been emotionally supportive, that she had been so excited at the dinner that she had expressed it clumsily. She said she was sorry if it had upset me. I accepted that. I told her I understood and that I appreciated her hearing me out. We ended the call warmly, and I genuinely thought it was done. The next family gathering was about 6 weeks later. My uncle's retirement party, a larger event, more people, a venue rather than someone's home. At some point during the evening, I was standing with a group of relatives I saw less frequently, people who lived in other cities and who I caught up with at these larger events. One of them, a cousin twice removed or something in that configuration, congratulated me on the house, and then said she had heard my parents had really come through for me. She said it in the warm tone of someone delivering a compliment to people who deserved it, and I understood immediately that she had heard this from someone in the family, and that the version of events my mother had introduced at my aunt's birthday dinner had continued to circulate after I thought it had been corrected. I said politely and clearly that actually I had purchased the house entirely on my own savings and that my parents hadn't been involved financially. She looked slightly confused, nodded, and moved on. I did not make a production of it. I simply stated the accurate version and let the conversation continue. My mother was standing close enough to hear me say it. The ride home from my uncle's retirement party was the first time I understood that what I was dealing with was not a single incident of clumsy phrasing that had been corrected and was over. It was something that had taken on a life of its own in the connective tissue of my family, passed along in the way that family narratives get passed along, absorbed as background fact by people who had no reason to question it, and every reason to simply accept it as part of the story of Nadia buying her house. My mother called me the following morning. I could tell from her opening tone that she was not calling to continue the conversation we'd had 6 weeks earlier in the spirit it had been conducted. She was calling because something had shifted, and the shift was not comfortable for her. She said she had noticed what I had said to our cousin at the party, and she wanted to talk about it. I said, of course, I was happy to talk about it. She said she felt that I had corrected her in front of family in a way that was embarrassing. I said I had simply stated the accurate version of events to someone who had been given an inaccurate one. She said the way I had said it had made her look bad. I want to pause here because this is the moment the conversation changed shape, and the shape it changed into is one I have spent considerable time examining since. My mother's concern had shifted from whether the information being circulated about my house purchase was accurate to whether my correction of that information had been delivered in a way that reflected well on her. These are two separate questions, and in her framing, the second one had become more important than the first. The accuracy of the narrative was apparently negotiable. How she looked in the moment of its correction was not. I tried to stay with the original question. I told her I was not trying to embarrass her. I told her I was trying to make sure that people in our family had accurate information about something I had worked very hard for. I told her that the version of events she had been sharing, even if unintentionally, gave the impression that my achievement was partially hers and my father's, and that it was important to me that people understood it wasn't. I said this as clearly and as gently as I could manage. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said she thought I was being ungrateful. She said that she and my father had given me things over the years that couldn't be measured in dollars, and that it was hurtful to hear me dismiss their contribution to my life as though it was nothing. I said I wasn't dismissing anything. I said I was simply being accurate about the specific transaction of buying a house, which they had not been part of financially. She said that was a very cold way to look at a family. I did not have an immediate answer for that because it landed in the complicated place, the place where the love and the misrepresentation coexist, and where clean responses are hard to find. I said I would think about what she had said, and we ended the call in a way that felt unresolved in a new and more significant way than it had before. I spent several days thinking about it carefully. I talked to my partner, whose perspective I trust because he knows my family well and has no investment in protecting anyone's feelings at the expense of accuracy. He said what I had been thinking but hadn't fully said out loud, which was that my mother had moved the goalposts. The first conversation had been about whether her original statement was accurate. When I established that it wasn't, the conversation had shifted to whether my correction was kind. And when I established that it had been as kind as I could make it, the conversation had shifted again to whether my insistence on accuracy was itself a form of ingratitude. Each shift moved further from the original question, which was simply, did my parents help me buy my house? The answer was no. That answer had not changed. But it was becoming increasingly surrounded by other questions that made it harder to simply state. My father called 2 days after my mother. His call was gentler in tone, but operated on the same logic. He said he thought this had gotten out of hand, and that he hoped I wasn't going to let a misunderstanding damage our relationship. I said it wasn't a misunderstanding. He said he understood I was proud of what I had accomplished, that he was proud of me too, and that he didn't see why we couldn't all be proud together. I said we could all be proud together, that was completely fine, but that being proud together was different from telling people they had contributed to something they hadn't. He sighed in the way he sighed when he thought I was being unnecessarily precise about something, and said he just hoped I would think about how my mother was feeling. I had been thinking about how my mother was feeling. I had been thinking about it more than I had been thinking about how I was feeling, which was a habit I recognized in myself from a long time back, the habit of prioritizing other people's emotional comfort over the accuracy of my own experience. I was trying not to do that here. I was trying to hold the line on something that mattered to me, without letting the discomfort of the people around me talk me out of it. The issue resurfaced at a scale I hadn't anticipated about a month later, at my grandmother's 80th birthday celebration. This was the largest family gathering of the year, the event that brought in relatives from 3 different states, people I saw once a year or less. It was held at a hall my aunt had rented, and there were probably 60 people there, 3 generations, the full breadth of the family in one room. I had been looking forward to it in the ordinary way, and had decided, consciously, that I was not going to raise the house situation unless it came up, and that if it came up I would handle it the way I had at the retirement party, calmly and directly. It came up within the first hour. I was talking to my grandmother's sister, a woman in her mid-70s named Vera who I had always been fond of because she was sharp and funny, and said exactly what she thought without apology. She congratulated me on the house, and then said that my parents must have worked hard to help me get there. She said it with genuine admiration, the admiration she was directing at my parents, for what she understood to be their generosity toward their daughter. I told her, as I had before, that my parents hadn't been involved financially, that I had saved for the purchase myself over 4 years. Vera nodded and said, "Oh, good for you then," and that was the end of it from her perspective. But my mother had been standing nearby, and had heard the exchange, and the expression on her face when I looked over was one I had never seen on her before. Not hurt exactly. Something more like the expression of someone who has just watched something happen that they had been hoping would not happen, and are now deciding what to do about it. What she did about it in the moment was nothing. She turned back to the conversation she had been having, and I turned back to mine, and the party continued. But something had changed in the air between us, and I could feel it for the rest of the evening, a coolness that had not been there before, not cold enough to be visible to anyone else, but present enough that I was aware of it every time we were in proximity. The conversation that followed happened a week later when my parents came to see the house for the first time. I had invited them, somewhat against my better judgment given the state of things, because I wanted them to see it, and because some part of me was still hoping that seeing the physical reality of what I had built would resolve something, would make concrete what all the words had not managed to make concrete. I had done renovations by then. The kitchen had been updated. The back room, which had needed the most work, was now the room I was most proud of. I had done a lot of it myself on weekends, with help from a friend who knew what he was doing, and had taught me enough that I could be genuinely useful rather than just present. My father walked through the house with the appreciation of someone who understood what the work represented. He made specific comments about the kitchen and the back room that told me he had actually looked rather than just moved through. At one point, he put his hand on my shoulder and said it was really something, and I believed him completely. My mother moved through the house more quietly. She said the right things at the right moments, but there was a quality to her attention that was slightly removed, like someone watching a film they had expected to feel more engaged by. At the end of the tour, we sat in the kitchen with coffee, and the conversation was pleasant enough for about 20 minutes, and then she said, in a tone that was careful in the way of someone who had been preparing a sentence, that she wanted to talk about what had been happening at the family events. I said okay. She said she felt that I had been publicly contradicting her in front of family in a way that was disrespectful, that correcting your parents in front of relatives was not something she had raised me to do, and that she wanted me to understand the effect it had been having. She said my father's side of the family in particular had noticed, and had said things to her about it. She said she did not think I understood what it felt like to be corrected by your own child. I let her finish. Then I said, as calmly as I could, that I understood it was uncomfortable to be corrected, and that I had not set out to make it uncomfortable. But I said that the alternative she was proposing, which was to allow an inaccurate version of events to circulate unchallenged through our family, was not something I was willing to do. I said that what I had accomplished was important to me, and that I had a right to have it accurately represented, and that accurately representing it was not the same as diminishing her or dismissing her contribution to my life in other ways. My father looked at the table. My mother looked at me with an expression that I recognized as the one she wore when she had expected a conversation to go one way and it had gone another. She said she thought I had always had a problem accepting help graciously. She said this was not new behavior. I asked her what she meant. She said that I had always been the kind of person who needed to do things alone, who made a point of not needing anyone, and that while she understood that was part of who I was, it was painful for a parent to watch. She said she had only wanted to share in my success a little, and that she hadn't expected me to make it into a conflict. That last sentence is the one I have turned over the most in the 2 years since. She had only wanted to share in my success a little, which is a one I understand and even sympathize with. but the way she had chosen to share in it was by telling people she had contributed to it when she hadn't, and when I had corrected that she had reframed the correction as the problem rather than the original misrepresentation. The wanting to share was real. The method of sharing had caused damage. And somewhere in the transition from one to the other, my response to the damage had become the thing we were talking about instead of the damage itself. I did not resolve the conversation that day. We ended it in the way of people who have said what they need to say and are not yet ready to find their way to the other side of it. My parents drove home and I washed the coffee cups and stood at my kitchen sink in my house and looked out the window at the yard I had been slowly working on, and I thought about what my mother had said about me needing to do things alone. She was not entirely wrong about that. I do prefer independence. I did want to do this on my own. Both of those things were true, but wanting to do something on your own and then actually doing it on your own and then wanting credit for having done it on your own is not a character flaw. It is a reasonable and normal expectation. The achievement and the acknowledgement of the achievement are supposed to belong to the same person. That is how it is supposed to work. I had done the thing was supposed to be mine. The weeks after my parents' visit to the house were quiet in a way that was not entirely comfortable. Not silent, we were still in contact, still texting, still doing the ordinary maintenance of a family relationship. But there was something that had not been there before, a careful quality to our interactions, a sense that we were all moving around the unresolved thing rather than through it. My mother's messages were warm but slightly shorter than usual. My father's were the same as always, which was itself a kind of information about how he was processing things, which was apparently by not processing them, and hoping they would resolve on their own given enough time. I was not going to let them resolve on their own given enough time. That is not how I am built, and I knew it. The unresolved thing was going to stay unresolved until someone named it clearly, and we actually dealt with it, and I was becoming increasingly clear that I was going to have to be the one to do that because nobody else was going to. But I also needed time to think about what I actually wanted from a resolution, because the thing I had been asking for so far, accuracy, the simple factual correction of a misrepresentation, was not the same as understanding. I could get accuracy by continuing to correct the record at family events every time the inaccurate version surfaced, and I had demonstrated that I was willing to do that, but what I actually wanted was something different. I wanted my parents to understand why it mattered to me, not just to stop saying the inaccurate thing, but to actually understand what the accurate thing meant, and why the difference between the two was significant enough to be worth the discomfort it had caused. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about the 4 years. I tried to find a way to explain them that would land with my parents in a way that the conversations so far had not managed. The thing I kept coming back to was the lunch, the brought-from-home lunch, 4 years of it, every working day. It sounds like a small thing, and in isolation it is a small thing, but it was also a daily act of choosing the future over the present, of deciding every single morning that what I was building was worth the small tedious sacrifice of not doing the thing the easier way. And my parents had not seen any of those mornings. They had not been present for the discipline. They had arrived at the result without witnessing the process, and I think that gap between not witnessing and claiming participation was the heart of what had happened. I was trying to figure out how to say that. In the meantime, the family narrative continued to exist independently of my efforts to correct it. I know this because about 6 weeks after the visit to the house, I received a message from my cousin Daniela, who I was close to and who I trusted to be honest with me. She said she had been talking to our aunt and that the house situation had come up, and that the version currently circulating was that I had bought the house with significant parental help and had then ungratefully denied it in public repeatedly in a way that had hurt my parents deeply. She said she was telling me this not to upset me, but because she thought I deserved to know what was being said, and because she had told our aunt that she wasn't sure that version was accurate. I read that message twice, not because it surprised me exactly. I had known the narrative was continuing to move through the family, but seeing it laid out that clearly the full shape of it was something different from knowing it abstractly. The original misrepresentation had now been joined by a second narrative layer, one in which I was the person behaving badly. The story had evolved from my parents helped me into my parents helped me, and Nadia won't acknowledge it, and is being cruel about it. And that second layer was doing something the first layer hadn't, which was making me the problem, rather than just repositioning the credit. I called Daniela and we talked for over an hour. She was one of the people who knew me well enough and had known my parents well enough over the years to have genuine context for what I was describing, and talking to her was useful in the way that talking to someone with real context is always useful. She confirmed what I had suspected, that the version of events she had been hearing had the shape of something that had been told multiple times in multiple directions, and that the telling had each time added a layer of grievance about my behavior that the original event had not contained. She also said something that I had not considered, which was that she thought my parents probably did not experience what they were doing as misrepresentation. She said she thought they genuinely believed, on some level, that their emotional support and presence in my life over 31 years constituted a form of help that entitled them to share in the public credit for the result. She said that for their generation, and in our family's particular culture, The idea that an individual achievement belonged entirely to the individual was not as self-evident as it was to me, and that their way of telling the story might feel to them not like a lie, but like a different way of accounting for what family meant. I sat with that for a long time, not because it changed what I thought, but because it added texture to it. I still believed that my achievement had been misrepresented. I still believed that mattered. But understanding that my parents were not consciously fabricating a false narrative, that they were operating from a genuinely different framework about what family contribution meant, made it possible for me to approach the next conversation differently than I had approached the previous ones. I asked my parents if I could come for dinner the following weekend. My mother said, of course. I drove to their house on a Saturday, and we had the meal and talked about ordinary things, and then after dinner I asked if we could sit and talk properly. My father turned off the television. My mother settled in the way she settled when she knew something was coming. I told them I want to try to explain something that I had not explained well in the previous conversations. I said I was not going to ask anyone to apologize, and I was not there to make anyone feel bad. I said I just wanted them to understand something about what the house meant to me, and why the way it had been described mattered. Then I told them about the lunch. I told them specifically and in detail about the decision I had made 4 years before, and what it had required, and what it had felt like to maintain it for 4 years, while watching people around me spend money I had decided not to spend. I told them about the Saturday morning I had sat in my car outside the real estate office before my first meeting with an agent, and had felt genuinely frightened, because the thing I had been working toward for 4 years was suddenly real and close, and could still go wrong. I told them about the Tuesday afternoon on the floor of the empty living room. I told them that those moments were mine, that they existed because of choices I had made and sustained alone, and that when someone else was credited with contributing to them, even with good intentions, those moments became something different. They became evidence of help rather than evidence of discipline, and the difference between those two things was the whole meaning of it for me. My father was quiet through all of it. My mother's expression had shifted about halfway through into something I had not seen in the previous conversations, something that was actually listening rather than preparing to respond. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said she had not understood that. She said she had not known about the 4 years in that level of detail, that I had not talked about the process much while I was going through it. I said I knew that I had kept it private because I hadn't wanted to make it into a performance. She nodded slowly. She said she thought she had wanted to be part of it so much that she had told herself she was part of it. She said it quietly, without dramatic inflection, in the tone of someone saying something honest that they had not said before. I felt something shift in the room when she said it. My father said he was sorry, just that. He was sorry. He said it looking at the table, and then he looked up and said he was proud of me, properly this time, without the we that had been attached to it before. I did not cry. I had been prepared to cry and did not, which surprised me. What I felt instead was something that settled rather than released, like a weight that had been held at arm's length for 2 years being carefully set down. My mother said she would talk to the family. She said she was not sure how to undo something that had been moving through conversations for 2 years, but that she would say what needed to be said. I told her I appreciated that. I told her it didn't need to be a production, just accurate. She said she understood accurate. We sat at the table for another hour and talked about other things, the house and the neighborhood and what I was planning for the yard in the spring, and the conversation was easier than it had been in months. Not perfect. Not back to exactly how it had been before all of this started, but something had moved that had been stuck, and the moving of it had changed the air in the room in a way I could feel. I drove home that night with the window down because the evening was mild and I wanted the air on my face. I thought about what my mother had said, that she had wanted to be part of it so much that she had told herself she was part of it. I had turned that sentence over many times in the 2 years since, and I keep finding new things in it. The want was real. The telling herself was real. The gap between the want and the reality was real. And her ability, finally, to see the gap clearly enough to name it, was what had made the conversation different from all the ones before it. That is harder than it sounds. Most people never manage it. Most people, confronted with the gap between what they wished were true and what is true, find ways to maintain the wish rather than acknowledge the gap. My mother had managed it eventually, and I was not going to undervalue that because of how long it had taken. The conversation at my parents' dinner table did not immediately fix everything in the family at large. I want to be clear about that because the version of this story where one honest conversation dissolves 2 years of accumulated narrative is a satisfying version but not an accurate one. What it did was fix the thing between me and my parents, which was the thing that most needed fixing, and from that fixed place, the rest of it became manageable in a way it had not been before. My mother did talk to people. I know this because the conversations changed, not all at once and not universally, but gradually, in the way that a narrative that has been corrected at its source slowly loses its confident footing in the world. My aunt mentioned to me at the next family gathering that she had heard she had been mistaken about the house situation, and that she thought it was impressive what I had done on my own. She said it with the slightly formal quality of someone delivering a corrected message rather than a spontaneous thought, which told me my mother had spoken to her specifically, and I appreciated the effort that represented. My cousin on my father's side, the one who had congratulated my parents at the retirement party, mentioned it more casually when I ran into her at a smaller gathering a few months later. She said she hadn't realized I had done it all myself, and that it made the whole thing even more impressive. I thanked her and moved the conversation along, because by that point I was less interested in the corrected congratulations than in simply being past the whole thing. The harder part was the layer that Daniela had described, the narrative about my behavior, the version in which I had been ungrateful and publicly cruel to my parents. That layer was more persistent than the original misrepresentation, because it had a more compelling emotional shape. A daughter correcting her parents publicly is a more interesting story than a daughter buying a house, and interesting stories travel further and are remembered longer than factual corrections. I accepted fairly early that I was not going to be able to fully undo that version, that it existed somewhere in the family's collective memory and would probably stay there in some form, and that trying to correct it comprehensively would require more energy than the result would justify. What I focused on instead was the relationships that actually mattered to me. Daniela knew the truth. The people I was genuinely close to within the family knew the truth, because I had either told them directly or they had been paying enough attention to form their own accurate view. The relatives who had absorbed the less flattering version of me were mostly people I saw once or twice a year and whose opinion of me, while not something I was indifferent to, was not load-bearing in my actual life. That distinction matters. Not everyone's perception of you requires the same level of investment to correct. My relationship with my parents in the year and a half since that dinner has been genuinely better than it was in the year before it. Not in a dramatic or transformed way, not in the way of movie resolutions, where a single honest conversation rebuilds everything from scratch. Better in the ordinary way that relationships get better when a thing that has been sitting between two people is finally named and examined and partially resolved. There is more ease. There is less of the careful quality I had noticed in the months of unresolved tension. My mother comes to the house sometimes and has started to relate to it as mine in a way she hadn't before, commenting on things I've done with it, asking about plans in a way that positions her as an interested observer rather than a co-author. My father and I went to a hardware store together in the spring to look at materials for a project I was doing in the yard. We spent 2 hours in the store and then another hour in the yard, and it was, straightforwardly and without complication, a good afternoon. He said at some point while we were working that he wished he had understood earlier what the buying of it had meant to me. I said it was okay. He said he should have asked more questions when I was going through the process, instead of just waiting for the result. I said I had been private about it, and that wasn't entirely on him. He nodded and handed me the thing I needed, and we kept working. That exchange has stayed with me because of how undramatic it was. The most significant reconciliations often are. The big conversations, the ones that shift something fundamental, tend to happen in the quiet moments between other things, not in the set-piece emotional discussions you plan in advance. My father and I processed something real that afternoon in my yard over a minor home improvement project, and neither of us made a production of it, and that felt right. The thing I have thought about most in working through all of this is the original impulse, my mother's impulse to share. I have tried to follow it back to its source, and what I find there is not something I can be straightforwardly angry at. She is a person who loves her children in a way that is expressed through involvement, through the sense of being woven into their lives, through the ability to point at things and say I am part of that. For most of my life that had been entirely true. She had been part of things. She had driven me places and helped me move apartments and listened to problems and been present in the accumulation of small ways that parents are present across the decades of a child's life. The house was the first significant thing I had done entirely outside that accumulated presence, entirely cleanly, without any thread connecting it to her participation. And I think what she reached for, unconsciously and with real love, was a way to reattach the thread, to make the story of the house a story that included her, because exclusion from the significant things in her child's life is something that sits uncomfortably in a person who has organized so much of herself around inclusion. I understand that. I hold it with more compassion now than I did when I was standing at a family dinner watching the credit for my 4 years of lunches float across the table towards someone who had not eaten a single one of them. The compassion and the clarity about what was mine coexist now in a way they did not in the first months of this. Both things are true simultaneously. Her love is real, my achievement is mine. The sentence does not need to choose between them. The house is still mine, obviously, and continues to become more mine with each thing I do to it, and each season I spend inside it. The kitchen I updated in the first year has become the room I know best because I use it most. The room where the light comes through a particular window at a particular angle in the late afternoon that I have never seen in any other place I have lived. The yard I have been slowly working on has a small section near the back fence that I planted in the second spring, and that came up better than I had expected, and that I check on with a pride that is out of proportion to the scale of it, but that I allow myself anyway. I have a neighbor named Frank who is in his 60s, and who has been in his house on the same street for over 20 years, and who has become someone I talk to over the fence on weekend mornings in a way that has become one of the small pleasures of my week. He asked me once early on whether I had bought the place on my own or with a partner. I told him on my own. He said that was something, doing it on your own, and that his own first place had taken him years to manage, and he still remembered closing day. I said I remembered mine too. He nodded and said you always would. You always would. I have thought about that as well. The Tuesday afternoon on the floor of the empty living room is not a memory I am going to lose or have diluted by time or revision. It sits in me at a specific address that nobody else has access to. Whatever version of the story circulates in whatever rooms I'm not present in, that afternoon is mine in a way that requires no documentation and no defense. I was there. I know what it was. The knowing is permanent and private in the way that the most significant experiences are permanent and private, carried in the body rather than in the narrative, present in a way that does not depend on anyone else's confirmation. I bought the house, 4 years of discipline and one Tuesday afternoon, and the whole long exhale of arriving at something you built from nothing. Mine in the only way that counts, which is the way that was there before anyone else had formed an opinion about it, and that will be there long after the family narrative has moved on to other things. That is enough. It has always been enough. I am just clearer about that now than I was before all of this started, and that clarity, frustrating and painful as the process of arriving at it was, is something I would not trade back.